notice that some of you are still logging in, but I want to get started so we have as much time as possible for discussion and question and answers. So let's get started. A gracious good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be just now. And thank you for joining us. Huawei and RCR are thrilled to share with you today a discussion of 5G security and why it's a shared responsibility and what you should be doing about that shared responsibility. So thanks again for joining us today. Here's a brief look at the agenda. We're going to walk through the scope of the 5G security challenge, talk about how 5G changes the security equation, and then talk about what's needed, how best to get there, some of the critical success factors, and the future and how best to prepare. And then we'll wrap up with a summary of the conclusions we've come to today, and time permitting, we will have questions and answers. You should see a Q&A dialog box at the top of your screen or somewhere else on your screen, depending on which client you're using. Just click on that to type in a question, and we will get to as many of those as we can. But before anything else, I want to introduce our featured speakers today. Joining us today is Andy Purdy, Chief Security Officer from Huawei Technologies USA. Greetings, Andy. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
And Paul Scanlan, Chief Technology Officer for Huawei Technologies. Paul, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mike.
So let's dive in, shall we? What is the scope of the challenge? Well, anyone who's been reading anything about cybersecurity over the past, I don't know, weeks or months knows that the scope of the challenge is basically that threats can come from anyone, anywhere, anytime. There is actually something known as malware as a service. All you need is access to the dark web and a credit card, and you can order malware up as if it were software as a service. Threats can come from disgruntled former employees, current employees, malevolent nation states, anywhere. So at this point, we're not talking just about the isolated topic of cybersecurity anymore. The real challenge is effective, proactive, consistent risk management. And that's the goal of every cybersecurity effort, or at least it should be. Now, how does 5G change the security equation? The good news is 5G has more and better internal security features than its predecessor. If there's bad news to go with that, though, it's that threat surfaces are much more expanded than they used to be. Firms like Gartner estimate that new IoT, Internet of Things devices are joining the internet at a rate of tens of thousands a day. So there are more connected devices, more connected services, more connected people, and that means there are more opportunities for malfeasance. Paul, maybe you could jump in here and talk in a little bit of detail about why 5G is more secure than 4G or any of its other predecessors.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So when the whole issue of 5G erupted, I'll say security, billions of things connected, and therefore the threat landscape is going to be bigger and all that sort of stuff, yeah? So if you just have a think about how 4G works, every time you turn on your smartphone and you start signaling with the base station, it's pretty easy to spoof the base station. Yeah, like it's very easy, in fact, to spoof the base station. So when we were developing 5G, we did a couple of very fundamental things, and I'm sure you're all experts and have heard this a million times, but I think it's worth just repeating why we did it and what we did. And the first thing was that we increased the encryption from 128 to 256 bits. But more importantly, what we did was we provided all the information in a pretty much like an SSL, a tunnel. And the most important thing about this is that it goes all the way through the base station over the transport network back into the core. So that means it doesn't matter whether it's a Huawei radio base station or whether it's an Ericsson or Nokia or anybody else's. The point is that the manufacturer of those cannot see any data. So two important points there are at the air interface. They're the two things that we've done. And as Michael sort of steps through these things here, you can see, you encrypt the subscriber's ID, etc. But there are a few other very key things, and that is between public mobile networks, we also close loopholes in the roaming. And of course, at the back end, the user authentication was also strengthened. So everybody talks about 5G, and the first they sing is 5G and security. Well, you're right. 5G is far more secure. You can step through the next one, Michael. 5G is far more secure than 4G. That's the first thing that everybody should understand. And this has been developed because of roughly 40 years worth of effort that's gone in by all the people in the 3GPP and the ETSI. And so 3GPP and the ETSI, I'm sure you're aware, but you know, they're members from pretty much every vendor. There's every vendor in there. There's pretty much representatives from every government, regulator, as well as telecom operators around the world. Doesn't matter which continent you're in or which political party you belong to. They're all there. Yeah. So that's the first thing that's pretty important, I think. Yeah. If you just step through to the next slide, please, Michael. Yeah. I think this particular one here, Andy, that you've prepared, this demonstrates the extent of all the different things that we've done, and you know, the threat landscape that that could happen. Yeah. So when we develop software and when we develop networks and solutions, we think about all the different ways that you could hack into a network. Yeah. So we think about people trying to, you know, spoof a device, putting some malware in the device, people trying to hack into the air interface, people to get in behind firewalls, you know, computers that are on the other side of firewalls, and people, you know, dropping in emails and everything. So we go through quite an extensive range of threats and threat modeling. And this is not done by one company, as I mentioned. This is done by several hundred people in all the different study groups in the ETSI and also the 3GPP and the ITU. I don't know if you want to say anything about this particular slide, Andy, because it's pretty busy.
I think this is a very important depiction of what you see happening globally as well. You see, as you know, the European Union 5G project began with their risk assessment. You see in some of the standards efforts that Paul and we will talk about later, trying to understand what the particular threats are, understanding what your critical assets and functions are, what are the most important controls. And when you think about it from a standards perspective, the question then becomes, well, what are the things that are so important that you want to create standards for them? And Paul talked about some of those standards. You may have seen a blog that Bruce Schneier posted recently where he said one of the problems in the path forward with 5G is that there's a whole lot of stuff where they don't do standards for. Well, they identify issues. They try to prioritize which are the most important for standards. Then companies like us, we're all kind of competing to add additional security enhancements. We add additional security enhancements on top of it. But the threat landscape and understanding the threat landscape as we roll out, as the different business scenarios, business cases for 5G are rolled out, the standards get updated based on the threat scenario for those particular landscapes.
Yeah, and there's another point also, Andy. You know, you mentioned about the threat landscape, and I've seen, you know, in a number of different blogs that, you know, as you have billions more connections because of the MMTC capability of 5G, you're going to have you know, a bigger threat area. Well, just go back to the slide that I just showed you, and if you just go back to both the encryption and also everything about the subscriber's ID, all those IoT devices, if they're based on either narrowband IoT, predecessor to, and or LTE-M and or the 5G components, then under 5G it's encrypted, and also you've got it tunneled. So I don't agree that that as you have billions of things connected, that you're going to have a you know, a more extensive or broader threat landscape. I don't agree with that at all. Yeah, but again, it depends how those things are packaged up and how a lot of those IoT devices, you know, which components of the standards they comply with. But if you just have a think about the problems, the challenges you have today, people connecting either via LoRa or Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or Zigbee or Z-Wave or Sigfox, etc., or they're using a 3GPP based standard called narrowband IoT. And the most important thing about that is that the 3GPP so far, touch wood, has not been hacked. And I think that's a particularly important thing to understand when everybody, you know, is talking about the threat landscape, etc., and whether you should have this or this, that, or anything else. All right, carry on, Andy. Sorry.
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that, Paul.
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Yeah.
I think that that previous conversation leads directly into a discussion of what might be thought of as the network evolution challenges. It seems that you can divide these into a bunch of groups here. I don't know, Paul, do you want to jump in here, or Andy, which of you wants to talk through some of these network evolution challenges?
Yes, I'll pick up on them in the first one. Okay, so let's talk about, you can call it cloudification if you want, but let's talk about the other area that we strengthen in 5G. So if you think about the 4G core network, and I'll say the simplicity of it, it's not really simple, but let's think of it as a simplicity, then we only ever considered one service type, really, other than separating things like voice, video, and messaging. But we never really had a proper service type definition, if you like, as we've tried to develop in 5G with the concepts of slicing. And so when we were considering writing the standards for 5G in the network, the core network specifically, and thinking about virtualization, not that they are necessarily the same, but we were thinking about how to look at different service types, because you could have, as you know, a slice of the network which is based on throughput or speed, another one based on lots of connections or latency, and that's one way of painting. But another one, and it's sort of highlighted here, looking at safety, privacy concerns, and things like that, or multi-tenancy, etc. Then you can start to think about whether they're done by industry type or by service type. So it wouldn't be unusual, perhaps, to slice the network, not necessarily based on the technical capabilities of 5G that we developed, but perhaps by service type or industry. So you could have, a version of health, a health slice, or an education slice, or a safety slice, or a manufacturing slice. And in some of those you would have different parameters, perhaps. But more importantly, the services in one would not be affected by the services in the other. So let's have a practical example right now. Here we are with a virus running around the world. It's very, obviously it's unfortunate, but everybody's now working from home, and all the kids and university students are studying from home. And the first demand that puts on the network is significant amount of uplink, all right? And that's not well catered for in 4G, as you know. But in 5G, uplink is handled much better, and therefore you get a better ability to balance uplink and downlink. And video, based on these types of scenarios, particularly in education and health and in public safety, which is cameras, it's all uplink, uplink, uplink. So you can see a lot of user-generated content. But more importantly, if we just come to the 4G scenario, in the 4G scenario, you have people doing virtual consultations, you have people studying, and you've got, I don't know a better way to put it, but little Johnny playing with his computer game, right? And they're all competing for the same resources. And that's what 5G will do a lot better. But if some of those components were, and we've heard about Zoom published on the network, we've heard about other incidences where perhaps some things that ought to be private are not private, or are not as secure as they should be. So one of the things we thought about in 5G is how to make these service slices more secure. And that's something that we've started to introduce through some of these ones here, when you're looking at different components of the attack surface and or the complexity of the architecture. And we considered those things even when we were looking at sort of the mobile edge computing component. What happens as we move a lot of the processing capability, a lot of the computation, in order to reduce the latency by moving some of that computing power further down towards the base station. But that introduces another type, that introduces a physical type of security problem, because it's fine to have perhaps a large data center that's secured. Well, what happens when you start having lots and lots of mobile edge computing facilities? You need to think about physical security around those things. The reason I wanted to paint that picture is because there's a lot more components in a network than worrying about, quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, a vendor and whether or not you think he is secure. And that's what we've tried to bring out here. If I just also highlight the one that says legacy technologies. So let's just have a think about network technologies and the components. There's no operator in the world, or very few operators in the world, that have a homogeneous network. That means from one vendor with one type of base station or one transport network and or one set of equipment from a core network provider. So that means you're going to have legacy. And in here, I think Andy written, some are 5 to 10 years, some are worse than that. Most of the operators, the telecom operators, they want 10 to 15 years worth of support for equipment. So they have a large number of different generations of products from different vendors throughout the entire network. We'll show another picture in a moment. So the complexity of this is enormous. So these are the challenges you've got. And by the way, it doesn't matter which vendor you're going to pick in the future. And even if you want to make a new vendor, as some people have suggested, AT&T or Telstra or British Telecom or Deutsche Telekom, they're not going to be able to swap out a network in a day or a week or a month or a year. So you're always going to have various components in the network that come from different vendors and different generations. They're all going to have different versions of software in them. This is not a simple task of, you know, excluding one vendor or doing this with one vendor or doing that with multiple vendors or introducing, you know, ORAN and things like that. Those are the things that are not going to fix these problems. Maybe we go to the next page, please, Michael. Yeah.
You know, this is probably my favorite slide in the entire deck, Paul.
Yeah, that's why I wanted the topic. That's why I wanted to put the slide in. So let me explain this. If there's anybody online, I don't know how many we've got, maybe 200 or 300 people, but I bet everybody out there downloads apps, and it doesn't really matter which OS you're using, but I bet everybody downloads apps. And the first thing the app says when you download it is, sorry to put it this way, but can I steal your data? Isn't that what it says? Oh, I think it asks you a different question. It says, can I have access to all your contacts, all your media, all your photographs, access to your camera? Everybody, right? Every single app asks for this. And what do we say? We say yes, because it's free. Correct? That's what we all do. And I bet everybody goes to Wi-Fi networks and we want to connect to that because it's free. And because it's free, we put in passwords that usually start with 0 and probably end in 0, or somebody else's, you know, telephone number or birth date and things like that. We do that all the time. So the reason for this picture, and the reason we're talking about a shared responsibility, is because down at this thing at the bottom there, which is talking about the vendor and the product security, the network layer, this end-to-end supply chain. I just mentioned at the beginning that we have representatives from every company, vendor, that have for 40 or 50 years been writing standards and thinking about threats and landscapes, how they change, and how to address them for the good of the world. That's what we do. But if you go right to the top up there, like cowboy territory, because there aren't those sorts of controls. Everybody does different things and apps come out from everywhere, and pretty easy to drop a bit of, you know, malware or Trojan horse inside an app and everybody will download it and it's free, and suddenly you've got everything you want across the whole network, potentially. Yeah. So the reason for this slide and why we want to talk about it being a shared responsibility, and if you animate, I think it's animated, isn't it, this one?
Yes,
Michael?
it is.
So if you press the button, hopefully you'll get to the animation. And if it's not, we might have moved it down a little bit. Here, when it's animated, I've shown 3 groups of, I'll say, security improvements that we put in 5G. And the reason I've shown that there is to highlight that we pay a lot of attention, go back to those first slides that we showed, on standardization and looking at different security threats at the network layer, everywhere from the device all the way through to the core network and even up into the cloud. The next component, which I've just put a few topics in, is really talking about the operation and maintenance of telecom operators, and that's the middle slice, and the text is actually on the bottom right. So I don't know if you've ever spoken to a telecom CIO or the CTO, if you know him really well, and you ask him, how do you handle security internally as an operation? These guys are very sophisticated. They have AI-based algorithms sitting inside the network that look across the entire network. They look at every IP address, they look at all the traffic. And what the AI systems do is it looks at the steady state. And once it's understood the steady state, then it starts looking for things that are abnormal. And that's when they start chopping up and blocking IP addresses, etc., so that you can't get out. So I had a chat with some of these customers, And they were telling me about the biggest problem they have. And the biggest problem comes back to exactly the first statement I made, which is about people, us. We download apps, we click on this, we click on that. And that's exactly what happens in telecom service providers. It's people sitting on the other end of the other side of the firewalls who click on an email and introduce malware on that side of it. And these are practical things I'm trying to tell you. These are practical problems that we face every day in networks. Now we come to the bit at the top. The bit at the top, the service providers, I'll say really all the consumers, this is where the challenge is. And that's why we thought, why we want a broader audience to talk about and try to address different problems, because we think this is where the problem really exists. Next slide, please.
Paul, if I can interrupt for a minute, it seems to me that there's a parallel to be drawn here in the IT world. People who focus on IT cybersecurity, they say that users are both the weakest link and the first line of defense. And it seems to me that you're saying something similar when you talk about customer behavior in the network environment.
You're right. And the problem we have is, quite frankly, look, my personal opinion, it's about time we started talking about security globally. I 100%. We're talking about it for the wrong reason, but I'm very glad that we are, we're finally talking about it. And I think, that as you've just pointed out, what's needed, and we talk about, protection, the next slide here talks about here. So, across geographies, networks, across products. But a lot of this starts with facts and training, education, right? So instead of having everybody around the world talking, I won't say everybody talking a lot of nonsense, but it would be very nice if we just talked to the facts. And we started educating the public and educating the regulators and educating the governments about a couple of things. Number one, what 5G can do, that 5G is not something to be scared. It's not going to fix the world, by the way, right? You're going to need a whole bunch of things to happen before you fix the world. But it's certainly not, that's this dangerous animal that everybody's been trying to portray it, and nor are any of the vendors that are working on it. None of them. But it starts with some education. So we have to be consistent. And I think these are three areas that are important, right? Consistency, pervasiveness, and seamlessness. And just step through to the next slide, if you like. Yeah.
How are we going to get there?
You got it. So I've just said, so it's all about trust and verification. Huawei's been scrutinized. I don't believe anybody else has been scrutinized. And if you go back to the very first picture, the one you said you liked, Michael, which has got, lots of vendors through different layers, lots of operators and everybody else, do you really think focusing on one vendor or one product is going to fix your security problem? It certainly isn't, right?
No,
so with Huawei, we have a couple of things that we believe. Number one, we assume nothing, believe nobody, and we're trying to confirm everything. Now, this is probably a little bit different to what you've heard and what everybody's been portraying about our company, but this is what we've been doing, okay? The most important thing is trust through verification. And just now, Michael, you mentioned that there were some parallels in the IT industry. Absolutely there are, and I put a few slides in here to try and demonstrate those sorts of things as we move through. So in the IT industry, we do trust everything, right? There's 31 countries. They all have a department or an authority that's responsible for verification, certification. They appoint trusted companies to do, in a laboratory, to do the testing. They have auditors, companies that they trust. This isn't just in one country. This is in 31 countries around the world. The process is very similar to, say, an FDA, right? So you need FDA approval for a drug, or you need HSA from Singapore. You need those sorts of things as well in the IT industry. So what we're proposing, trust through verification. Just step down through the next one, Michael. So what are the
I'm sorry, Paul.
No, don't jump in.
Again, in the IT world, cynics used to say the IT industry loves standards. That's why there are so many of them. But it seems to me that the networking environment is evolving in a different way. It seems to me that there are standards that are emerging that are being adopted by most, if not all, vendors, and that those standards seem to be gaining traction in a way that can make security more seamless and more pervasive and more consistent. Is that an accurate read?
Maybe I describe it a slightly different way. You see, if you just go back probably half a century, but if you go back to say the early 90s, when everything was sort of an oligopoly, yes, before we started introducing multiple telecom companies per country, pretty much the telecom operator was, you know, a representative of the government. It was generally a public-owned company, and you know, reported directly to the whole thing. And I'll say the inbuilt, the given SLA was always that this was for public good and always considered, you know, secure and all those sorts of things, right? Sort of by design, way back in the old days. That was always the premise, yes? And so we created all these standards bodies to try and go through it in a very rigorous fashion. It took a long time, you know, each one was over 4 years, you'd develop a set of standards, but things moved pretty slowly back in those to do it. But that's what's carried over generation by generation, from fixed to beginning of mobile, and then through all the different versions of mobile and all the other components, and then moving into other areas. Things like cloud, I'll say virtualization and things like that, have not been standardized to the same level necessarily, yes? The IT industry has done things a little bit differently. Some of those products are used in the network area, and those that are often standardized along the way, but not always. Okay, so that's why here, when we're talking about, you know, what are the critical success factors? Standard, standard, standard. Test, test, test. Verify, verify, verify. So who should set the standards? Who should do the testing? Who should do the verification? Who should be the auditors, right? Who's going to trust? You need to trust somebody. I just mentioned in the IT, where we have 30 odd countries and I think 77 auditors and test labs. But we've got, you know, say 180 countries, 200 countries around the world. Why not have 200? Well, that's because a lot of the other countries believe and trust those 31 countries and the 77 companies that are doing this verification and testing, validated by experts, yes? That's terribly important. You do need to have the software in escrow. You can't just have cowboys, everybody testing everything and source code leaking out everything. So you do need processes and things like that, yes? And it really does come down to process. This is all about process, okay? Because you can test a product, but how do you know that version, as I went back earlier, how do you know that version of the product is in every single part of your network, as opposed to having different generations of it from the same vendor that, you know, have been tested, haven't been tested? These are the challenges we've got. So, you know, if it's not regular, if it's not comprehensive, yes, and you don't have processes that the whole world standardizes on, you're never going to have anything secure.
Michael, can I add a fact?
Of course.
So I think a broader context we may want to remember when we look at the larger picture. I mean, think about what the European Union did, where they did a 5G risk assessment. Think about, we're talking about risks in cyberspace when you talk about a threat matrix. So the idea of the global community, the network operators, the exchanges among ISPs and vulnerability sharing, that overarching risk management is in effect the framework. And then you go down and look what individual countries are doing in terms of their risk management for their government, for their critical infrastructure. And then they try to decide. So for example, President Trump issued an executive order a couple years ago for the executive agencies to use in this cybersecurity framework. Now that's not a standard, but it is a risk analytic tool. It creates an ability to compare what different suppliers are doing, what different agencies are doing, what standards or best practices they may be following, gives them the ability to compare what the suppliers are doing. And you look at the global community, each country seems to like particular aspects of standards. So you've got the criteria, it looks like they're studying Equipment Security Assurance Scheme. The European Union has. So there is a growing recognition of the importance for risk management, the importance of having objective and transparent basis for knowing which products are worthy of trust. So I think some of these efforts to get the buying community, the network operators, to be more focused on risk-informed procurement requirements. And then on the other hand, hopefully we can get the community to encourage the telecom equipment suppliers, us and our competitors, to raise the bar on assurance and transparency so that we can kind of raise. So this kind of using market forces, I think, can help complement this important work with standards.
I think that's a really important point, Andy. And to your point, if the slide that's up shows there's a snapshot of some of the organizations that are involved and how we're involved in some of those. But I wanna highlight sort of the global vision that you alluded to, and how different countries and different organizations are all trying in their own way to move towards a model that looks more like the one that we've been describing here, where you have an ecosystem of standards such that trust is based, in fact, on verification, and that verification comes from both internal testing and beating on things.
Paul, I wonder if you want to, one of the things that I've been so impressed in different countries in the world where I've been with you or before or after you, the discussion you have in particular countries about transformation, how they go from 3G and even 4G into a 5G world, and how that fits in the larger picture of what the European Union is trying to do.
All right, so obviously that varies a lot. It varies by it basically varies according to, I'll say, two parameters, and one is I'll say the maturity of a country. Whether it's how far along it is from developing to developed or advanced, and the second one is the telecom operator, and really whether he's I'll say a very traditional operator, or whether he's somebody who's heading towards a more, I'll say the word service provider, or that digital provider of solutions. And I'll just give you a simple example. At one end of the spectrum, he's providing basic voice and SMS, and I think everybody knows that. But at the other end, he probably doesn't even charge for the mobile connectivity at all, because he's offering other types of service over the top. Or he monetizes video instead of voice and things like that. And there are examples of operators doing that from Africa all the way through to Korea. Probably they're the two ends of the spectrum. But you've also got operators who are, unfortunately, it's unfortunately, but they're keeping legacy systems going because they've got an established and a captive client base, and it's all about making money, right? And if you look at the governments, then you've got some governments that are very sophisticated, and they're trying to encourage operators to roll out networks in rural areas. And you've got other ones that want to charge billions for spectrum. And of course, if you charge billions, then operators don't have much money to spend on networks. So you tend to get a very unbalanced distribution of network coverage, etc. But just to give you an example of how complicated some of these scenarios can paint out. Everybody talks about 5G and its value in say manufacturing as an example. But if you just have a look at where people are rolling out, it doesn't really matter which country you pick, they're pretty much rolling them out where there's people, right? If I ask you where the manufacturing plants are, they're generally not where the people are, yeah? And also, if you look at how they're deploying networks for the people, it's all macro cells, it's all outdoor stuff. But of course, our biggest challenge is indoor. And of course, now you've got to have a telecom operator who goes from selling SIM cards and building masts to having to do, very sophisticated indoor coverage inside a manufacturing plant or in a hospital. He's got to understand that business. So you can see that it's quite varied. You've got regulators who understand the value of spectrum to its contribution to GDP by industry type. And you've got others who just think, you've got buckets of money and I can take it because my finance minister needs lots of it. You've got everybody in between. Look, it's a fact there, right? I mean, how do you, we may say don't charge $1 billion for spectrum, but do we know what challenges a government has in trying to balance its books? We don't, right? But there is value in understanding that if you can deliver broadband, and just now you've seen, just these last 2 months, you've seen user behavior change completely. Anybody who thought there wasn't a use case for monetizing video or in education or in health or in telepresence for for small, medium, and large enterprises is wrong, right? The business cases are there, you can see them. Every operator in the world should be looking at the traffic stats and saying, right, I think we know how to monetize this and how we need to sell, how to get our money for 5G and everything else. Very straightforward, I would have thought. So you've got to take a little, sorry, yep.
I didn't mean to interrupt, Paul, but I realize, and this may be, I don't think this is unique to the United States, but it is another factor in what you're describing. If you look at the advertising that's being aimed at consumers, some of it seems to imply that all they need to do is upgrade to the newest phone and they will magically have access to 5G. I mean, some of these ads are showing people watching 8K video from inside their homes in places where this networking technology isn't even available yet.
Yeah, so you've picked up a very interesting point. I mean, if we move down that line, everybody's talking about AR, VR is a great use case. Yes, it is, but in a different way. You've just pointed out that most of these scenarios are indoor. And as I just mentioned, what's the worst case scenario? What's the worst deployment you have today? Indoor, right? Every operator in the world, because it's been very expensive traditionally using traditional DAS systems, distributed antenna systems. But now as you move into, and we've done it in 4G before, but in 5G, you have so much more capability and all the equipment is so much smaller. All the backhaul is IP. Okay, it's been IP as well in 4G, but the point is, it's very straightforward, very simple to actually deploy indoor networks to take advantage of a lot of these things. But it is a different methodology, different deployment methodology. Operators need to think a bit differently to try and monetize these sorts of things. Yeah, I know we're moving off onto business cases instead of onto security, but you have to understand, how are you going to deploy these things in a different way? I gave you the example of, the mobile edge computing component. So they're just a couple of, I digress a bit perhaps, but in terms of different principles, just about every country that we speak to, when we're allowed to talk to the government sensibly, we have mature discussions about security, about addressing the threat landscape, about explaining how 5G works, how it's different to 4G, about how the services will transform, about how telecom operators will need to deploy it. Generally, you deploy it 5G on top of your 4G. Range of reasons. It's not essential, but that's sort of the first area that you would deploy in order to capture the enhanced mobile broadband traffic from. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about how we get there and what things people can think about and do now, and how maybe a bit more about how we at Huawei are addressing the issue. As we've said, security is in fact a shared responsibility. And as Paul and Andy have outlined, there are a bunch of improvements in 5G to help address this issue. But at the end of the day, it's all about the people involved, the point that Paul tried to make. And these are some points that were made not by us, but by Emmanuel Delpon from Orange Group, the CTO of Orange Group. And I'm not going to read you the slide. I know you can all read. But if you look at the bottom three bullets, the 5G network security solution coverage, you need security and standards, security in equipment, and security and deployment security. So this ties directly to the points Paul and Andy have been making so far, that it's not just about building the technology. It's not just about complying with the standards. You need processes in place that are constantly monitoring the evolution of the technology and modifying the processes that you use to evaluate and comply as the technology evolves. This is an interlocking set of moving targets, and there is no fix one and you're done approach that's going to work here.
So you're right, and I'll just add one more point there. Emmanuel's one example that you've quoted here, but I know pretty much every CTO of certainly all the top 10 telcos, and probably a lot more of them. And they all talk in exactly the same frame. They might use slightly different words, but they're pretty much exactly on the same behavior, and including the ones that I've met in the US as well. So this is not just one group CTO speaking and his opinion. This is precisely what's going on all around the world, right?
All right. There, as you can see here, there's a list of some detailed discussion about how the responsibilities are shared and distributed between telcos and vendors and who's responsible for what. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. But
Yeah, yeah.
Andy, maybe you and Paul could talk a bit about this particular slide and all the elements involved, who the stakeholders are, and what their role is in the network security standardization, audit, test, and certification processes.
I'll just
Yeah.
be very
Now,
brief.
I'll try and be quick. You want me to do it, Andy, or you want to do it?
Go ahead, Paul.
Okay. So this is a snapshot of what's going on in very specifically in the mobile network, right? So 3GPP together with GSMA, GSMA led. So they're not a standards group, GSMA. They're an industry alliance, but every single telecom operator in the world subscribes to them. 3GPP are the guys who wrote the standards. So on the bottom, on the left, hanging underneath that, what you see manufacturers and you see the members. And this is not exhaustive, but the most important thing is you've got all the top guys, including all the vendors, and they all comply, and they're all part of this. Okay. On the right-hand side, we've got, and I think you mentioned just now, the BSI out of Germany and NCSC in the UK. And just as of March, you've now got the Institute of Telecoms in Poland. You've got 3 government-based companies, yes, who are responsible for test and audit of network-based components in a telecom network. Yep. You have 3 companies sitting underneath there from Germany, UK, and Spain, who are either auditors or test laboratories. So this is for mobile network security equipment. It's audit, test, certification. The program is run by GSMA and the 3GPP. Can we step through to the next slide? Yeah, next slide, Michael. Yep. I just got to bring up my thing so I can see it. Right. Now, if we compare what, and I just gave you a prelude earlier, if we were to compare what's going on in the network technology area, so that's the SCAS, NES, right? That's what's going on at the moment by the 3GPP. And you can see it's based on security baselines and audit for mobile network equipment. It covers cloud, digitalization, software-defined, pretty much everything, right? It covers everything from product development, lifecycle processes, threat analysis, and modeling. Now, if we compare that with, say, the common criteria that's been running for many years and it's very mature in the IT industry, yeah, it covers predominantly R&D process and lifecycle management audit. But the reason I want to show the comparison, what I believe the most important is, if you look at the accreditation and the regulators, you see that on the right-hand side, those things that are in the IT industry are very well accepted. Okay, regulators' recognition, the governments recognize them, a large number of laboratories, they're all audited. The problem is it's quite a complex process and it takes some time. And this comes back, Andy, to your earlier thing, which is, if we have a test methodology and we test everything to the right specs and we have the right accredited companies doing all these things, and we do it globally and everybody trusts and follows and does it together, then you get some decent results at the output. So what we're proposing, what we're suggesting, if you move to the next slide, Michael.
There we go.
Yep. I've just painted a picture here and said, well, here we've got everything on the right-hand side. You can see, these are the countries that are certified or have certification processes. If we look at what we've been driving here in these 3 boxes, well, why wouldn't we try to train, teach, enhance the existing certified members and laboratories to move to not only just do IT certification, but also to do network. Start with the 5G, the 4G, etc. Okay, so we will try to increase the number of regulators and get greater government recognition. Then we have a larger pool, and everybody, as you mentioned right at the beginning, would be able to leverage off everybody's experience. What we didn't mention was that in the network telecom business, all the technology guys talk to each other, all the IT guys talk to each other, all the CEOs talk to each other, all the CSOs talk to each other. They all share information to learn best practices from each of them. And this is what can happen if we were to adopt this type of approach. NCSC has scrutinized Huawei, BSI has scrutinized Huawei, and we just offered to go to Poland to say, we'll submit our products as well for your scrutiny. So let's move down to another couple of slides, which you probably aren't terribly familiar with, but everybody's been talking about Huawei, right? Well, in 2018, in December, we kicked off a software engineering transformation program. It's about trustworthiness, yeah. And why did we do it? If you look at the left, industry trends, things are changing. We're moving from simple networks to quite complicated networks. In the middle, this concept of trustworthiness and cyber resilience is becoming more and more important to customers. Not that they didn't pay attention before, but it has become more important because the threat landscape is different. Now, on the right-hand side, I've chosen to put in the Oversight Board report of the NCSC in the UK in May, which was in 2019. And they've pointed out that, Huawei software engineering could be improved. I don't know if anybody's seen any other document from any other vendor ever by anybody. So it's very hard to say what the benchmark is, but anyhow. So Huawei started this program that we need a corporate level transformation. You move down to the next slide. So the principles, the reasons we did it was to demonstrate to customers and industry experts that we are doing this. Not we just didn't say we're going to spend $2 billion, that we're really doing it. We took the findings of the NCSC OB report seriously and we're addressing them. And if governments, industry bodies, customers have concerns, we're addressing them and we'll demonstrate those things. And that's why we said, partners, we have these laboratories in different countries. Why we opened up in Brussels last year, we opened up a facility there where customers can come and they can see everything in Huawei. But this is not about fixing a bug or having 5 versions of SSL sitting on a software package. This is about cultural transformation, recognizing, understanding that we don't make $122 billion by accident, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we do it through focus, R&D, standards, innovation, customer. That's what we do. But we can improve, and we recognize that we can do better. So if we come to the next slide, as Michael just put it up, we didn't do it in isolation. How do we know what the right thing is? We took 250 industry standards and best practice analysis. We compared it with, what have we been doing? What are the synergies? What haven't we done? What conflicts, what gaps have we got? We integrated it with our product development processes and we created a framework. Next slide. And I thought I'd give you 3 very simple examples here of what we're trying to do. End-to-end integrity. End-to-end integrity means being able to trace from a customer requirement every single line of code, who wrote it, who tested it, who modified it, who committed it, who burnt it on silicon, who's got that bit of silicon, who installed it in a board, and who deployed that board, and what have you done with it. That's what we mean by end-to-end. And I won't jump into all of this, you can read it yourselves, but the last point, product lifecycle and contract lifecycle. I gave you examples, and I think you made the comment earlier, Andy. You've got 2, 3, 4, 5G networks. You've got vendors from all over the place. You've got 10 to 15 years worth of equipment. What happens when you change one thing or you verify one? What's the process that an operator has or the vendor community has in trying to handle the entire product lifecycle, even if it's end of life? Who's responsible for making sure that the security patch or the next software patch has been loaded on it, for example? These are not simple things to talk about, right? But this is what Huawei analyzes and discusses with governments and with our customers and with other industry peers. What's your next slide, Michael?
Well, it's about time to start wrapping up so we can leave a little time for questions and answers. But I think that, well, first of all, Paul and Andy, thanks for the sagacious comments and observations. I think that if we were to try and summarize everything down into something distillable, into something the audience can take home, I think the points that you've made here that bear repeating is that if you're going to have security, it's got to be consistent, pervasive, and seamless. And standards are critical to achieving that goal. And every element of the value chain, every element of the networking value chain must be subject to rigorous, credible testing to make sure that you're doing what you plan to do and that what you plan to do aligns with what needs doing. So I think from that perspective, it's critical, I think, to ask the question, what should we do now, or what can we do first to get started? So I'm going to turn that into the first question I toss to you guys for the Q&A part of our discussion. If you're listening to the past 45, 50 minutes of discussion and you're motivated to go do something, and you are a telecom operator or a carrier or something like that, what's the first couple of things you should be doing? Paul, you want to take that first, and we'll toss it to Andy?
Yeah, I was actually just reading through all the questions here that you had online. I wasn't sure we were going to take all the questions this way or answer them this way. You know, the first thing I would really love would be, it would be very nice if we could have mature discussions across the industry with all players to discuss all of the components that we just talked about. In other words, fact-based discussion on how to fix problems rather than go pointing fingers and saying generic-y things and, you know, all of that sort of nonsense, right? So education is terribly important, and you need to get that into the right people's hands, and that's the policymakers. So I would say that's probably the first one or two thing I would like to do. The second thing I would like to do, which is related to that, is really to leverage the work that's been done in the Common Criteria Alliance groups and to use that as a foundation, because everybody trusts that today. If you look through all the government agencies, they're the same ones. You know, NCSC, BSI is there, Institute Polska is there. That already exists. Of the laboratories, the 77, those three that I mentioned that are already part of NISAS, they're already there. So I think, you know, they're two things that I think we could do. They're very pragmatic.
I think I'd like to encourage independent groups, third-party groups, to organize those kinds of conversations. You could have the press there or not have the press there. I also think that there needs to be an effort, hopefully led by the telecom operators, independent group, transparency initiative for all telecom equipment suppliers. I think the idea of calling on us and our competitors to really lay out the information about what we do and how we do it and why we do it, calling on us to create a minimum set of industry standards and best practices for assurance and transparency. I think there are ways to encourage us and our competitors to compete, to raise the bar for cybersecurity and assurance, and I think that would be helpful. I think there's some lessons learned from the CDM program in the US, the Continuous Diagnostic and Monitoring Program. I think it's important to have better monitoring of networks and systems so that the dots can be connected when there are anomalous conduct. Dots can be connected between the classified and unclassified world so we can detect threats and respond to them much more quickly.
Yep.
You know,
maybe
I'm gonna.
Maybe I'll pick up a couple of your questions that are online here. Do you mind if I just answer a couple of them, because we'll run out of time very quickly?
Yeah, we are. I was just going to ask you to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Look, so there's a question here from Dean Skidmore about narrowband IoT or LTE-M. That's really a function of how much data you want put through. Yeah, it's narrowband IoT is really designed for low bitrate stuff. You know, tens of kilobits per second, whereas LTE-M is pretty much good for up to 1 meg. Just as a simple thing. There was one question here also, I think also from Dean. You know, why should I trust Huawei 5G RAN and NSA SA core technology or products? The answer is really simple. Don't believe Paul. Go and ask our customers. Yeah, you want to know who's really doing what? Go and talk to our customers. Don't believe Paul. Don't believe Huawei. Go and talk to BSI. Go and talk to NCSC. That'd be my suggestion. Yeah. Was a 4G network ever compromised? I am not aware of any that have been compromised, but there may have been compromises done in alternative ways, like, as I mentioned earlier, people get on the other side of the firewall, but the 3GPP, those components have not been hacked. Yeah.
So I have a question. in the IT world, as technology has evolved and voice and data have become integrated and switching has been moved closer to the edge and all of that, there have constantly been, I'll politely call them debates over who is responsible for what part of the security equation. What is the best organizational approach to take if a company wants to focus on proactive risk management? Who should be part of that team? And who should not be part of that team, if anybody? And how high up in the organization does it need to go? Andy, maybe you could start by taking a shot at that, and Paul can jump in.
Well, I think using some of the concepts behind the NIST cybersecurity framework, the idea of trying to make sure that a focused risk analysis of what are the most important assets and functions and what is being done, what has to be done to address the risk, what are the standards or best practices being followed, and what is the risk profile given the current posture, the current business objectives, and what is the target profile. And the similar things related to the question of, okay, what about supply chain? What are you asking of your suppliers, and making sure that you are asking the kinds of things that you see, for example, in the manufacturing sector profile. I think it's important for larger companies to hire independent experts to help with the analysis of how well are they doing at analyzing what they should be doing, at doing the correct things, and are they on the right path to a better risk posture, and is the mechanisms and time frame and tools they're going to use to get to that better risk posture appropriate. But I think just like independent financial audits are important, I think for larger organizations there need to be independent analysis of what's being done, so there can be greater transparency, so that the senior executives and the boards of directors have some basis for confidence.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind picking up a couple of these questions relating to health and electromagnetic radiation. There's a couple here. There's one here about 5G and COVID-19. I don't think anybody should waste my time on that answering, but anyhow, there's enough on the internet to show that that's rubbish. But speculation about, radio frequency transmissions and health. There was only one study, and that was done back in 2000 in the US, and that was done very specifically on mice. But if you look at the more recent study that was done, so that one was not comprehensive, is the reason I raise it. But if you look at the more recent studies that have been done by the World Health Organization and others, including those from the EU, you'll find that there's no correlation between radio frequency energy from mobile networks and health. So that's those myths ought to be busted pretty easily. Relating to things like the US government curtailing exports of chips to Huawei and things like this, and the other components, that's really unfortunate that the world has to go down this route. But we spend $20 billion on R&D, and that's probably why our products are where we make a lot of money.
One thing regarding Internet of Things, I encourage you to look at the Internet Society work, the Online Trust Alliance that I think Craig Spiesel is work for IoT security that can provide good guidance for more technical standards efforts and for larger organizations.
All right, well, we are just about out of time. So again, Paul, Andy, thank you so much for providing insights and observations that I'm sure our audience will find helpful. And audience, thank you for taking time out of your busy days. I know it's incredibly unusual times for us all, but I think this is valuable information you can use to help improve security at your organization, not just within your 5G deployments, but more broadly. So if you ask questions that we haven't gotten to, we will answer as many of them as we can via email as soon as possible after this is over. And we will also be providing copies of the slides in PDF format for those people who want them. Again, thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Be safe, be well, and thank you again for your time. Go wash your hands.